Good evening, I'm David Kramer with Alaska Weather. As always, please visit our website, weather.gov/Alaska. You can get updates to the forecast or check out any watches, warnings, or advisories that we might have out for your area. You can also call our weather info line, 1-800-472-0391. Get any updates to the forecast through that means as well. And you can email me at the address at the bottom of the screen, david.kramer@noaa.gov. Since we have no watches, warnings, or advisories out right now, we're going to jump right into fire weather. And we do have an area up in the Yukon Flats area where we do have some high and some extreme fire danger up there today, and then down in the Copper River Basin, western parts of the Kenai Peninsula, and also out over the Bristol Bay area. Keep in mind, in these locations, there is an increased risk for fire danger. Taking a look at our satellite imagery, one of our main focuses is a low pressure system south of the Alaska Peninsula that is pushing a front into the southern portions of the Gulf of Alaska. As we watch this again, we can see it extending some of that cloud cover out over Kodiak Island, where we are expecting a lot of rain there, and starting to see the edges of that cloud cover make it in over the southern portions of the Kenai Peninsula, bringing some rain to those areas as well. And then out over much of the interior part of the state, we can see some of that cloud cover associated with some of the showers developing out over the interior and up into the Brooks Range. And then finally out over the Panhandle area, we can see some cloud cover bringing in some rain to northern places along the Alaska Panhandle. Taking a look now at our weather for the remainder of the day, we can see our frontal system pushing into the southern portions of the Gulf, bringing rain to those areas through Kodiak Island, places around Bristol Bay, and by the Alaska Peninsula. Further out to the west, we have some areas of fog, some mixed with rain out over the Bering and for the Aleutian Islands. Up the west coast of the state, some showers from the remainder of southwest Alaska, but seeing some fog from St. Lawrence Island up the rest of the west coast of the state and the Arctic coastline. Out over the mainland part of the state, we do have some thunderstorms starting to pop up in the afternoon and evening hours for the interior, and that's going to extend down close to the Alaska Range. But down in south central, just some isolated areas of rain are expected. And then down in the Panhandle area, we have rain from much of the area with some of those showers pushing out further to the north. As we look into tonight's weather, some of that is going to diminish as high pressure moves in over the Panhandle area. However, with that front coming right behind this high pressure, we are expecting rain to start to push back in as that front extends into the Gulf of Alaska now, bringing rain all the way along the North Gulf Coast through much of south central Alaska, much of southwest Alaska as well, and some areas of rain on the backside of that low by the Alaska Peninsula, extending throughout the peninsula and down into the eastern Aleutian Islands. Up through the mainland part of the state, we are going to have some lingering showers, especially in the evening time frame, that are going to diminish throughout the night. And then as we move up along the Arctic coastline, high pressure helping to provide fog for the Arctic coastline, down much of the west coast of the state, out through the Bering Sea, we will see fog, and down by the western Aleutians. As we move into Wednesday, that fog is going to linger as high pressure extends out over the western Aleutians, fog out over the Bering Sea and along the northern portions of the west coast of the state, and along the Arctic coastline is another area of high pressure lingers up there. Our low that has been relatively stationary by the Alaska Peninsula is going to continue, and it's going to continue to bring rain to the eastern Aleutians, the Alaska Peninsula, throughout southwest Alaska, the North Gulf Coast, including much of south central, and some areas along the Alaska Panhandle. And now we do have a low that's formed on the old frontal boundary that's pushing up from the south now, going to continue to bring another round of rain to the area. Out over mainland Alaska, low pressure lingering there as well. We are expecting to see more thunderstorms in the afternoon and evening hours on Wednesday. As we move into Thursday, that low is going to continue to hang out over the mainland part of the state, bringing another chance of some thunderstorms in the afternoon on Thursday that could linger into the evening as well. High pressure up along the Arctic coastline, continuing to bring fog to the area. That fog is going to extend down the west coast once again down towards the St. Lawrence Island area, and more fog out over the Bering Sea, as we do have high pressure extending now once again over the western part of the Aleutian Islands. Our relatively stationary low by the Alaska Peninsula is going to continue to spin and bring more rain to the Kodiak Island area, some areas of southwest Alaska, the Alaska Peninsula, and for the eastern Aleutians. Our other low is now pushed up into the northern part of the Gulf and is pushing its front right into the areas just off the coastline of the Alaska Panhandle, bringing widespread rain to the Panhandle area and some rain along the North Gulf Coast as well, with some isolated areas as we get to more interior locations of south central Alaska. Taking a look now at our temperatures for Wednesday morning, starting off in the Panhandle, are expecting temperatures to drop into the mid to upper 40s for most locations of the Panhandle. That's going to be true for the south central area as well, to include Kodiak Island. Mid to upper 40s are expected. As we get into the interior, staying a little bit warmer there, dropping down to the lower to mid 50s, and that's going to extend out for the western portions of the interior as well. Colder up along the Arctic coastline, dropping down to right around freezing. But as we move down the west coast of the state, dropping down into the 40s for most locations. Some areas like Gamble going to be a little bit colder, dropping into the upper 30s. As we move down into the YK Delta area, dropping down to right around 50 degrees, and then right around 50 for the Bristol Bay area as well. Mid 40s for the Alaska Peninsula, and then right around 40 degrees for the Aleutians. Highs Wednesday afternoon going to jump back up into the mid 40s for the Aleutians, into the 60s for much of southwest Alaska, into the 70s for the interior portions of the state. Cooler along the coastline, getting up to around 60 degrees, and then staying in the 40s for the Arctic coastline. Down in south central Alaska, getting to the mid 50s by the water, into the 60s for interior locations, and in the upper 50s for the Panhandle. Moving into Thursday morning, temperatures dropping back down into the 40s for the Panhandle and south central areas. That is going to extend out west for much of southwest Alaska as well. In the interior, as we saw Wednesday morning, temperatures going to drop down into the 50s, and then along the Arctic coastline, temperatures are going to drop down right about to freezing. For the Aleutian Islands, temperatures dropping down to right around 40 degrees, with St. Paul dropping down to 43. For high temperatures Thursday afternoon, temperatures getting back up into the mid-40s for the Aleutian Islands, into the 60s for much of southwest Alaska, 70s again for the interior, and into the 40s for many locations along the Arctic coastline. For south central Alaska, getting into the 50s along the coast, 60s in the interior, and right around the mid-60s for much of the Panhandle area, a little bit cooler as we get closer towards the water.
And now, aviation weather around Alaska.
For aviation, we'll start off with a look at our flying weather on Wednesday morning. Out over the Bering Sea and Aleutian Islands, widespread IFR conditions are expected. Some of those MVFR conditions are going to start to creep up into southwest Alaska and areas of south central as well. However, as we move up to the north into interior part of the state, we are expecting primarily VFR conditions. But as we get into the Brooks Range and along the Arctic coastline, we are expecting conditions to drop with IFR conditions along the Arctic coast. Down in the Panhandle, MVFR and IFR conditions are staying just off the coastline out over the Gulf of Alaska with VFR conditions for the Panhandle. However, as we move into Wednesday afternoon, some of those conditions are going to start to sneak into the more northern locations of the Panhandle with MVFR conditions expected there and IFR conditions making it to the islands right by the Gulf. As we move into south central Alaska along the Gulf coastline, we are expecting MVFR conditions with IFR conditions for Kodiak Island. Interior part of the state going to continue to be VFR, and VFR conditions now expected for much of the Brooks Range, with some MVFR and IFR conditions right along the coastline of the Arctic coast. And that's going to extend down the west coast of the state as well, with those MVFR conditions right along the water's edge. As we move down into the Bering and Aleutian Islands, expecting widespread IFR conditions. Moving into Thursday morning, continuing to see primarily IFR conditions for the Bering and Aleutian Islands, with MVFR conditions extending into the Bristol Bay area and up through much of the western portions of the Alaska Range. Into the interior portion of the state, primarily VFR, but as we drop out over the west coast of the state, expecting MVFR conditions along the coastline that will extend up along the Arctic coast as well, with some IFR conditions out by AKwx and out east by Kaktovik. Dropping down to the North Gulf Coast, expecting some MVFR conditions to remain, with MVFR and IFR conditions for the Panhandle area, IFR conditions as we get further to the south. Thursday afternoon, continuing to see IFR conditions for central and southern locations of the Panhandle, with MVFR conditions further to the north. The North Gulf Coast is going to also continue to see MVFR conditions throughout Thursday afternoon, but VFR conditions for the rest of south central and all of the interior part of the state. Up along the Arctic coastline, MVFR and IFR conditions are expected, with MVFR conditions along much of the west coast as well, and then IFR conditions out over the Bering Sea and Aleutian Islands. Taking us to our passes for Wednesday, Antarctic Pass will start off IFR and improve to VFR conditions in the afternoon, as well as at Adigan Pass. Lake Clark and Merrill will both remain MVFR throughout the day. Rainy Pass will start off MVFR and improve to VFR conditions in the afternoon, as well as at Windy Pass. Isabel will also be MVFR, improving to VFR conditions, and Mentesta will also be MVFR, improving to VFR. Down at Dehne should be VFR throughout the day. However, at Portage, expecting through the pass and the eastern side to be MVFR throughout the day, but VFR conditions on that west entrance. And then for Chilkoot and White, both going to start off VFR and then drop down to marginal conditions in the afternoon. For our freezing levels on Wednesday, our surface freezing line off the Arctic coastline, then we have an area of 8,000 feet stretching through the southern portions of the mainland, 6,000 feet right along the North Gulf Coast, and those 6,000 feet lines are going to ride through the Alaska Peninsula and through much of the southern part of the Bering and Aleutian Islands. For our icing on Wednesday, out over the southeastern portions of the Bering Sea associated with the low pressure system in the area. We are expecting above 8,000 feet over southwest Alaska down through Kodiak and the Alaska Peninsula, then over central and eastern Aleutians as well. Above 8,000 feet is expected there. For our jet stream, starting off over the south central locations, we are expecting southeasterly winds around 80 knots there, becoming 65 knots out of a northeasterly direction as we move through the southeastern portions of the Bering. Northwesterly flow 65 to 80 knots out over the western Aleutian Islands, and then out over the northwestern portions of the state around 50 knots out of a southerly direction, getting up to as high as 90 knots out over the northwestern portions of Canada. And then down in the southern parts of the Panhandle, we are expecting winds out of a westerly direction around 60 knots. Down to 9,000 feet, the strongest winds associated with our low pressure system out by the Alaska Peninsula. We are expecting winds up to as high as 55 knots out of an easterly direction through the Barren Islands area, and then dropping down to around 35 to 45 knots out over the southwest coast of the state. Then out of a northerly direction, 45 knots out over the eastern Aleutian Islands. Pretty light winds in most other locations. Dropping down to 3,000 feet, pretty similar flow to the 9,000 foot winds. We are expecting that easterly flow around 50 knots through Prince William Sound area, through the Barren Islands and areas around Bristol Bay. And then northerly winds out over the eastern Aleutians, 30 to 40 knots is expected, with 35 knots out of a southeasterly direction just off the Gulf coastline of the Panhandle. Then for our turbulence all along the North Gulf Coast, below 5,000 feet is expected, below 4,000 feet by the Bristol Bay area. And then finally by the eastern Aleutian Islands, we are expecting that turbulence below 3,000 feet, with the rest of the area not seeing a lot of the stronger winds.
Here at the end of the Earth, it still feels like a place for raw exploration and adventure. It's vast in all directions and ground zero for some of the biggest questions we have about the climate. But when we decided to make a series about the frozen places on Earth, we knew there would be one hurdle we would need to jump over first. What is the cryosphere?
The what?
Ooh.
I have no idea.
While I'm aware of the cryosphere, I don't actually know what it is.
It has something to do with ice. All right, that's all I got.
How do you get people acquainted with the cryosphere when most of us don't even know what it is?
Hey, so here we are in Washington, D.C., standing on the roof of NASA headquarters. That's the Capitol building right behind me. And what headquarters does is kind of serve as the focal point to connect the dots.
That's Dr. Tom Wagner, NASA's cryospheric program scientist at headquarters. In short, Tom is responsible for making sure NASA knows what the current status of the cryosphere is.
The cryosphere is everything from the snow that falls by your house to the icy reaches of the Himalayas, to the big ice sheets of Antarctica all the way at the South Pole, and also the frozen ground of the Arctic, and even some of that frozen ground that's currently under the ocean.
If you had to break it down, you'd have a mix of sea ice, snow cover, permafrost, ice sheets, and glaciers.
Right now, our best predictions are that sea levels will rise anywhere from 1 to 3 feet within the next 100 years. 3 feet of sea level rise has the potential to displace about 100 million people, which is a lot of people that need to find new homes.
Our current reality places us at a near tipping point, and the cryosphere is playing a huge part in that delicate balance.
So one of the things people don't know about NASA is that we study the Earth, and we've been doing that since NASA's inception back in the 1950s. And we study the frozen part of the Earth in a variety of ways.
Missions like SNOWX, Airborne Snow Observatory, Oceans Melting Greenland, Operation Icebridge, Arctic Boreal Vulnerability Experiment, and countless other labs and individual researchers stand at the forefront of monitoring the cryosphere. But this year was a particularly big year.
3, 2, 1, and liftoff of Grace Follow-On, continuing the legacy of the Grace mission of tracking the movement of water across our planet.
2 state-of-the-art satellite missions are being launched in a single year as part of a major attempt to understand Earth's frozen places. Our scientists are answering hard questions, sharing stories from the field, and giving their best predictions for what we can expect of a warming world. We're taking you with us as we follow NASA explorers on their journey to the frozen ends of the Earth as they study our rapidly changing world from satellites, planes, and boots on the ground.
What we can do really well from orbit is we can tell when a surface of land is covered in snow. What's tricky is though, how thick is that snow? And it's even trickier how much water is in that snow.
What we think of snow depends a lot on where it falls. If you live in the eastern US, maybe it's fun. Or maybe it's just a pain.
But if you live in parts of the world where they depend on the water that's in the snow for a large fraction of their total water that they use for drinking, for agriculture, for industry, for hydropower, the snow is a very important natural resource. For example, in the western part of the United States, 80 to 90% of their renewable water comes from snow.
Snow is one part of the cryosphere that many of us have actually encountered before, but it also plays a critical role in regulating the Earth's climate. Through decades of remote sensing, NASA has kept a close eye on the ebb and flow of snow cover.
We now have a 52-year record of snow cover in the Northern Hemisphere, and we can see changes in the extent of snow cover over the time period, particularly in the last few decades, where we can see that the snow cover has been retreating. It's been melting a lot earlier in the springtime.
The extent is relatively easy to do, and it has been done over the years. What's tricky is though, how thick is that snow? And it's even trickier how much water is in that snow.
That tricky part is known as the snow water equivalent, or how much water would actually be in a layer of snow if it melted. NASA and its partners have taken to the air to help solve this elusive mystery. First, there's the Airborne Snow Observatory, or ASO, a small plane outfitted with a couple of instruments, one of which measures snow depth using LiDAR. LiDAR measures distance using light from lasers. Since 2014, ASO has flown over basins in California and Colorado, taking before and after looks at snow depth. Scientists subtract the snow-free summer data from the snow-on winter data to get an idea of the snow depth. There's no single way to measure all types of snow across the globe, and so NASA's other airborne campaign, SnowX, is testing different combinations of sensors. This winter, SnowX will test a new instrument, the Snow Water Equivalent Synthetic Aperture Radar and Radiometer, or SWISAR.
SWISAR consists of 2 main components, one of them being the radar and the second one being the radiometer.
So with the radar providing the depth of the snow and the radiometer providing the density of the snow, we could put those 2 things together and get the snow water equivalent. Here in the chamber, we're going to measure different radiation patterns at our different frequencies and do some full system testing in this chamber. This chamber kind of enables us to isolate various types of radiation and interference. And in about a month, we're going to take the instrument, mount it on a Twin Otter in the Grand Mesa in Colorado, and we're going to fly it over the Grand Mesa and take various different measurements. This is what we call our engineering flight.
Making sure the sensors are calibrated is key in order to face the challenges nature will throw at them.
Half of the area that gets covered by snow every winter contains trees and forest. and the trees make it difficult for the sensors to see the snow that's underneath the trees, so it makes it difficult for us to measure how much snow there is. After the snow's had a chance to sit on the ground for a while, it gets denser and denser and denser over time, and it changes, which is another reason why snow is very challenging to remotely sense. It doesn't stay the same, it's constantly changing. One of the things that we often do in the field is go dig what we call a snow pit. We literally dig a pit in the snow so we can see all the different layers. The layering is very important.
All this digging is part of ground truthing SnowX, a way of matching up what the airborne instruments see and what is actually sitting on the surface. The ultimate goal of SnowX is to figure out what the best combination of instruments would be for a future satellite mission in order to get a global picture of snow.
We need to know how much snow is in a snowpack, because if we have too much snow and the snow melts too fast, then you can get flooding. And if you don't have enough snow, or if the snow melts too early, that can lead to a longer wildfire season, a more intense drought, and we need to know these things for water resource planning.
After we had a record that was about 15, 20 years long, we started noticing that the extent of the ice in the Arctic was getting smaller over time.
And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Welcome back for the marine forecast. We'll start off with a look at our ice edge. We do have open water now pushing well to the north of the Point Lay area, getting up towards Wainwright. However, as we get to Utqiagvik and areas further to the east, we have a lot of thicker ice there. And we still have some lingering ice in the Kotzebue Sound area, as well as the very eastern side of St. Lawrence Island. Taking a look now at our marine forecast, starting off in the southeastern portion of the state, southeasterly winds 10 to 15 knots in the inside waters. As we get out into the Gulf, southeasterly winds 25 knots, seas 7 to 9 feet, getting higher as we get further to the north. And in the northern portions of the Gulf, easterly winds 35 knots there, seas 11 feet. Then on Thursday, winds diminishing, dropping down to 15 knots in the northern part of the Gulf, with seas up to as high as 10 feet. As we move into eastern portions of the Gulf, south to east winds 20 knots there. And in the inside waters, strong winds southeasterly 30 knots in the southern inside waters, dropping down to 15 knots in the central areas, and becoming north 10 knots as we get further to the north. For Wednesday, out over the south central area, starting off in the Gulf, easterly winds 30 to 35 knots, strongest up to the north, with a barrier jet that's forming along the North Gulf coastline. In the Prince William Sound area, easterly winds 25 knots there. And then in the Cook Inlet area, northeasterly winds 25 to 30 knots, getting up to as high as 35 knots to the west of the Barren Islands. Then on Thursday, winds dropping down over all these areas. In the Cook Inlet area, northerly winds 10 to 15 knots are expected. Easterly winds to the west of the Barren Islands, 20 knots expected there. Out over the western portions of the Gulf, light winds around 10 knots, and then northern locations of the Gulf, east to south winds 15 to 20 knots, and in Prince William Sound, northeasterly winds 15 knots are expected. On Wednesday for the Alaska Peninsula and Kodiak Island, starting around Kodiak Island, east to southeast winds 25 to 30 knots, seas as high as 13 feet, highest on the Pacific side. Then as we move down over the Alaska Peninsula, you can see the circulation around the low pressure system out over the Bering and northeasterly winds 25 to 30 knots. But as we drop to the south of the peninsula, westerly winds 20 knots, becoming southeasterly on the eastern side of that low, 25 knots are expected. Then on Thursday, we're going to see similar flow around that low pressure system. In the Bering, we're going to see winds out of a east to northeast direction, 25 to 30 knots, becoming northerly south of the peninsula, 20 knots there. And then on the eastern side of the low, getting closer to Kodiak Island, southeasterly winds 20 to 25 knots. And then in Shelikof Strait, easterly winds 20 knots are expected. Wednesday for the Aleutian Islands, starting off for the central and eastern Aleutians, winds 20 to 25 knots, and getting the highest on the southern side of the eastern Aleutians, 30 knots expected there. And then northwesterly winds for the western Aleutians, 10 to 15 knots, seas as high as 8 feet, highest by the eastern Aleutians. On Thursday, continuing to see the northwesterly winds, 15 to 20 knots for the western Aleutians, 25 knots for the central and eastern Aleutian Islands. Along the west coast of the state, primarily a northerly flow up north by St. Lawrence Island and the Norton Sound area, northerly 10 to 15 knots, and then getting as high as 20 to 25 knots as we get down the west coast of the state by Nunavik Island, out by St. Matthew and the Pribilof Islands. Then on Thursday, flow becoming light and variable for the Norton Sound area, northerly winds around St. Lawrence Island area, around 15 knots there. Easterly winds along the coastline by Nunavik Island, 15 to 25 knots, strongest as we get by the Kuskokwim Delta area, and then out by St. Matthew Island, northwesterly winds 15 knots, and by the Pribilof Islands, northerly winds at 20 knots are expected. Along the Arctic coastline, we have winds out of a north to northeasterly direction, 15 knots. Picking up a little bit along the west coast of the state, still primarily out of the north, 15 to 20 knots are expected there, seas as high as 4 feet. Then on Thursday, continuing to see light winds along the Arctic coastline, 5 to 10 knots out of a northerly direction, and continuing to be northerly down the west coast of the state, a little bit stronger, 15 to 20 knots are expected. For a recap of our weather for tonight, we do have a low pressure system and associated front by the Alaska Peninsula that is extending out over the Gulf of Alaska, bringing rain all throughout the North Gulf Coast into south central Alaska, Bristol Bay area down by the Alaska Peninsula as well, and pushing its way into areas along the Alaska Panhandle. As we move up into the state, thunderstorms and shower activity is going to diminish through the evening and overnight hours for the mainland. And we have some fog along the Arctic coastline and the west coast of the state down through the YK Delta area. Fog also out over the Bering Sea and western Aleutian Islands. As we move into Wednesday, going to continue to see fog in the same locations due to high pressure over the western Aleutians and high pressure out along the Arctic coastline. Out over mainland Alaska, low pressure out over the interior is going to allow for afternoon showers to develop, with particular for thunderstorms to also develop in those afternoon and evening hours, and then rain for much of the southern mainland. For Alaska Weather, I'm David Kramer. Thanks for being with us.
These forecasts are for planning purposes only. Call 1-800-WX-BRIEF for a formal pre-flight briefing. Always file a flight plan before you go flying. The U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary urges you to leave a float plan with a friend or the harbor master before you go boating.